All right, we are live. I would say live at 5. It's 5 o'clock, I think, in Luxembourg, where Richard's is today, and we're chatting to Richard Russell. I'll give him a second to introduce himself shortly. My name is, for anybody that doesn't know, is Alan Boyle. My business is Saltwater Consulting, and I help technology companies scale well. And speaking of scaling, today we're going to be talking about OKRs, objectives and key results. And the expert in the room is Richard Russell, and I'm delighted to be talking to you today, Richard. So perhaps you can give me a quick intro.
Yeah, for sure. So, as you hear from the accent, I'm Australian, but I live in Luxembourg. I've lived in London for 10 years as well. I worked at Amazon and Google for a couple, 6 years at Google and 2 years at Amazon, which is where I picked up a lot of the techniques that I teach. Now I'm independent and I work mostly with executive teams of growth stage startups, usually from 50 to 500 people or thereabouts, usually the CEO and the immediate executive team, quite often a few layers down especially into the product team and engineering teams, and I work with them to help them scale. And the framework that I use is OKRs, and I kind of use OKRs as a bit of a Trojan horse for getting leadership coaching in and teaching some leadership methods and so on as well. But certainly there is just the basics of teaching how OKRs work and to help them scale.
Great, thanks, Richard. Yeah, I mean, also an ex-Amazonian myself. You and I could probably do a couple of follow-up calls about working backwards and all sorts of other types of conversations as well. But OKRs is the interesting one, and that actually came out of Google, and I think it was Andy Grove from Intel that's popularized it back in the early 70s, and then I think Google adopted it early 2000s, and I think it's the goal-setting mechanism of choice for scale-ups and technology companies.
Yeah.
And I like what you said there about the coaching. It's you have conversations with leaders and it's like, okay, well, why don't we put this in? Why don't we put a bit of structure? Why don't we align teams through OKRs? So perhaps you could tell me a little bit about your approach. And I suppose the first question I have is, when should a scale up start embracing OKRs? Does this happen pre-Series A? Does it start happening at Series A? What is your thought around that?
Well, so okay, on the topic of when they should start, I think that it really comes down to when you have a problem that you can solve with OKRs. And for most companies, that tends to be when they get to around 30, 50, 80 people, thereabouts. The problem tends to get fairly acute as you go beyond 100, 150. And once you get to 2, 3, 4, 500, you've got so many embedded processes in there, it becomes very critical. It's also quite a lot more difficult to implement, but just because of the scale and the number of people who need to change. So that's what I usually recommend. But my approach is that I always start by trying to understand from doing discovery interviews with the leaders what problems they're really having and what problems they want to solve. And the reason I do this is because OKRs can be a bit like a lot of other things like Agile and Scrum and other types of things, a bit of a one-size-fits-all approach. But I prefer to sort of customize it for making sure that it actually addresses the real problems that they're facing, partially to make traction, make it work, but also just because there's different ways of doing things, and in different organizations you have different cultures and different needs.
And you just mentioned traction. There's actually a book, it's the EOS system, Traction, and they talk about smaller companies may start adopting that operating system, and as part of that, it's setting their big hairy goal, which is 10 years out, and then bringing that into 3-year, 1 year, where you set your key your main objectives, and then your 90-day rocks, and those would be the key results. So I think what you're saying, you've got a bit of product market fit, assuming your product started or product led at the beginning. And then you move into okay, we got 30, 40, 50 people. We now need to start aligning these teams.
Yeah.
Okay. And then in terms of like, do you take an approach where you would get, because it takes time to do this, right? To put OKRs in properly could take some companies, depending on size, upwards of a year to put it in properly. But I mean, do you start with a specific set of people, with a leadership team? Do you start on the edge and say, right, we're just going to put OKRs into the product side? What is your approach?
Well, I found that if you start with people with lower down the organization, like the product team or whatever, it can be very helpful. But you almost always run into a problem. And the problem is that you don't have enough context from management to be able to set the right kind of OKRs for the product team. And you're depending on too much alignment across the company. So I find that it's always best, the way I prefer to start is to start with the executive team and setting company-wide OKRs. By doing so, you have an impact across the whole company and you tend to solve problems across the company. If you're working in a subset, like as I say, a product or a function, or the product team, then you tend to run into the problem of you make some progress here, but the rest of the company is still behind, and you're still sort of like not getting traction across the company. and management is thinking in a different way, and so then
Mm.
you don't always get the traction there. Whereas if you get management to buy in first, and you do that, and they're the ones who are usually feeling the real problem, then they're the ones who actually then drive the change through the organization and can create that alignment. In terms of like speed, I mean, yeah, it can take a year or more to really get it working well. But I find that even just the very first conversations actually deliver value. So when we set OKRs the first time, it might take a month to sort of just go training, discovery, training, and setting OKRs. And now we've got some clarity around strategy. We've got some clarity around what that means for this quarter, and it starts to have an impact. And I just recommend people to start doing things and iterate on it. That's the main thing that that's some of the main approach that I have, as opposed to like perfect a process and then then release it.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. Sorry, you just froze there for a second, but I think we're all back. There's probably, I think we had about 60 people or 67 people register for this. So thanks to everybody that is on, and we got people from various different countries connected in different parts of the world. So please feel free to ask questions if you do have questions. If I can get to them in line, we'll answer them in line. Otherwise, reach out to each of us afterwards, or connect with us, or ask questions. But yeah, any questions that come through would be great.
Yeah.
Richard, in terms of the leadership team, so you engage with the leadership team. They obviously have a strategy. I mean, if it's a scaling company, they have a strategy. Well, were you laughing? Maybe they don't. But they have an idea of where they want to go. They know the vision. They're on the rocket ship, but now they just want to get the teams aligned. So do you sort of take a look at their overall mission and then convert that into an objective? And would you say to them, you've got to set an objective almost for a year, and then you can break it down into smaller chunks in terms of the key results? We can work out the key results later. We just need to come up with something quite tangible, I suppose.
Tangibility is critical. I laugh or smile because most companies think they have a strategy. They think they have a vision and a mission. They think they're very clear about this. Usually what's going on is it's kind of very clear in someone's head, or it's clear in quite a lot of their heads, or they have a PowerPoint deck that illustrates their strategy well, but it ends up being, when you try to express this strategy in terms of like, these are the things we're going to get done, and here's how we define success, which is sort of making that strategy concrete through the mechanism of OKRs. As you do this, you discover that actually the strategy is very ambiguous. And frequently enough, the most frequent situation I see is that the strategy is more of a list or a collection of things that we could do, or all of the things that would move the needle. And it's not a strategy; it's just a list of things. And it might have narrowed it down somewhat, like, more products, more users, more markets, that kind of thing. But it's almost like, okay, you want to do everything. So now, where do you start, and where are the trade-offs? And so what I do recommend, like, I usually recommend to people just focus on the current quarter, because if you go too far ahead, you end up sort of tying yourself in knots a bit. It does vary on the company. Some companies really prefer to have a year and have a clear idea of at least what their objective is. But frequently enough, we just go with, okay, let's just go for a quarter. At the end of the quarter, we'll revise this and see how we are. Now, some of those objectives would roll over. Even some of the key results would roll over, and that's fine, because it's a learning process, and it's all about taking your strategy, taking your understanding of your strategy, clarifying it, and turning it into something concrete, so that you can communicate to the rest of the organization, so that then you can empower those teams to do things. And as you're doing this, you sort of learn about which things work, which things don't work, where's the ambiguity, where are the problems, and how do I go forward and improve this next? And that's that iteration that's really critical.
Yeah, no, it's amazing. And I like the way you say, just get stuck in and do it. You kind of say, we know where we want to go in the future. We have more or less thought a year out, or at least maybe the finance people have thought a year out, or we know what we like to try and achieve.
Yeah.
But for the next 90 days, let's try and organize everything around what we need to try and do. And I love the word priority. Originates from meaning of one. And I sat down with a team, I think a tech team, some time back, and they said, well, we've got 40 things we need to do. Okay, so you got 40 things you need to do. And you're going to do all 40 of them. Absolutely, we're going to do them. And I think trying to sort of prioritize and realize that okay, there's a couple of key things we need to do that are going to support the overall strategy. And there may be initiatives that fall in underneath that. And that also creates a bit of confusion, because people are saying, right, how do I set a key result? Or is it actually a project or an initiative? Because in the OKR language, you have initiatives to support key results. So the key result might be you want to get to, the next 100 customers in a different market. But you may have different initiatives, like a project to go into the new market, or to set up an office, or whatever. So I think the main thing is just try and get people aligned, and I think some advice I got ages ago, I think one of my first consulting engagements when I was really battling to get some traction with a team was Alan's show by doing. Just get in there and actually just start with something, set a key result for yourself or with a small team and actually start delivering on that.
Yeah.
And in terms of, and we're jumping around a little bit, so forgive me, and I'm sure maybe some of the questions will start coming through now, and I can share. But in terms of software, this is where I had a challenge before as well. We were implementing OKRs. The team they had a really good mechanism of communicating in their weekly meetings. They used Google slide shares. It was very collaborative. They had Google Slides. People would jump in and all fill in the slide beforehand, and they'd run their meeting. And then we introduced, as part of the OKR, an OKR tool. Now, there's loads of tools out there. There's Ally, I think that was bought by Microsoft. There's Lattice, there's others out there. But the introduction of the tool actually caused challenges because everybody had to sort of try and switch things out or try and run APIs into that tool. And they ended up sort of fussing around getting the tool right. And I ended up focusing on the tool too much that you kind of missed the point. What are your thoughts around software and the role software plays?
Yeah, so I mean, my take on this is that software can be in the OKR space can be really useful. It can actually solve problems. But here's the thing: you want to start. The OKRs is primarily about communication. It's primarily about people and human interactions, and so you want to start with that. And that's why I start with a small scope of like just the executive team, just company wide. Let's communicate that, and then doing this. If you're communicating on that level of like, here's our company objectives for the whole organization, let's communicate about them. Let's have check-ins with the next layer down, or the project leaders, or the product leaders, or the functional leaders on what we're doing here, and all that sort of stuff. You can do this with all of the existing tools. You can do it with combination of email, Zoom meetings where you present things, a presentation, a poster, and all that sort of stuff. Putting the OKRs into the regular metrics reviews, putting them into the email newsletter. Whenever you celebrate something, refer to the objective or the key result that you're trying to get to. So these things you don't need software for. When you need software is when you have a larger set of OKRs that you need to coordinate and track and sort of be tracking across the board. Now that only happens when you have a relatively large organization. You can get by with this with quite a large organization, like 50, 200 people, 300 people, without using any software, just talking about things. And part of the reason for that is actually that if you're using OKRs, you don't have to have one OKR per one set of objectives and key results per person or per team or per manager. You just need them where you need them. So you might just have company OKRs, a product OKR, and some for particular teams that need to make major changes, like marketing or an operations team that needs to sort of have some sort of transformation, some sort of change about how they're doing things. But you don't need it for every single manager. That just creates confusion. And that means that if you look at it from each person's perspective, the individual contributor, they then look up and see like, well, I'm kind of working on that project, that product. So I've got an OKR set there, but then there's a manager there as well. So they've got an OKR set there, and I've got my manager and then his manager or her manager, and so on. And I've got all these OKRs, and it's confusing, and that's a problem. And that's a problem that if you go down the software path, it tends to generate that problem because software is usually set up to drive engagement, and then they want to have more OKRs. So you're sort of incentivized to do this. So I recommend just holding back from the software until you have a specific problem you want to solve, where software can solve that problem.
Yeah, I think if people are very good at reporting and they've got their reporting mechanisms in place, all they need to do is add a line item in for their OKRs, and they can manually report on that until they get to a point where, as you say, it requires maybe some software or better management, or they find that they're shifting their conversation more towards OKR, which means it lends itself more towards using software. Richard, a couple of questions coming in, and one or two actually that spoke to what you were talking about earlier. And actually, I'm going to start with Noel Walsh first. Talking about OKRs, getting them involved at the management level. So it's easy for the executive leadership team to say, right, let's go, okay? And it's probably also easy for the individual contributor to say, okay, well, at least I've got some focus now. I know what I'm working on. But the poor management level, they're the ones that are managing up, down, sideways, and now they've got to use this new system. Do you have any, and you talked about using OKRs as a coaching tool. Do you have any sort of strategies around getting the next level of management or the management levels up and running on OKRs?
The middle management sort of area.
I would guess from Noel's question that's what it is. I could be wrong. Noel, if I'm wrong, please just
Well, so I think that it's in many ways it's the key thing here is that you need to have whatever level you are, whether you're at middle management or wherever, you need to have the context of what's the strategy, what am I trying to achieve? And now this is where it really depends on senior management having clear OKRs in the first place to be able to turn their overall strategy into something concrete, right? Once they can do that, then it becomes a whole lot easier for you at the next level down, especially at the product level or business unit level, to be able to set meaningful OKRs, right? My experience is that going that next level down, once you have the executive team using OKRs well and using them regularly, they understand how this works and they're using them, and people are seeing them using them. And now once you're seeing this happening at your management level, it becomes relatively easy to apply it to your own level. So in that sense, it's kind of it happens quite organically. I do find that quite a lot of OKR consultants love to have these huge change programs where we train each group on things, but I do find that every group you go down through becomes easier and easier, because it's literally like they have the context. But to me, the biggest thing is referring to the context of what am I actually trying to do. Start with the objectives, make sure the objectives align, and then actually go downwards to ask what kinds of key results can I deliver to deliver this objective, and that gets the buy-in of people involved. So I hope that answers the question, Noel.
It does to me anyway. And I think in terms of the leadership team, do you find a bit of resistance sometimes from maybe more traditional teams, or engineering product absorb it and they love it, and then suddenly you get pushed back from marketing saying, no, we're not interested in this, or sales saying, we're not interested in this? Have you seen that before, and how do you deal with that conflict at senior management level? Because you almost need to get that full buy-in straight away.
Yeah. So that's actually why I do the discovery first, to talk to everyone, to understand where each individual is at. And that's also why it's really helpful to just start with the executive team, because it's a team of 6 or 8 or 12 people or whatever it is, and it's quite manageable. So sometimes you end up with resistance from people who are very traditional or have their ways, or think that Scrum is enough, or whatever they're thinking about. Sometimes it's because, well, we do sales and we don't need this because we have sales quotas. Why do we need OKRs? And that kind of thing. And the thing is that my approach to this is usually that, well, if you have sales quotas and they're working, then you don't need to put OKRs on top of that. Just work with sales quotas. It's fine. If you want to make a change, you might want to have an OKR on top of that, just for that 5 to 10% of the extra work that you want people to do. But as a salesperson or as a marketing person, one of the things that you're really wanting to do, one of the things you're really interested in, is what's the rest of the company going to deliver that I can sell? And how do I capture that in a really clear value statement so that I have something sellable? And connecting these two sides of the coin together, product engineering, operations and sales, customer support, operations and customer support, and sales and marketing, connecting them all together. OKRs at the company level really connect them together, because that's how you focus people on building a thing that is sellable, such that I can then meet my quota. But it does vary depending on who they're talking to.
And that's interesting how you can keep sales and say, look, you've still got quotas, you've still got to sell, you still have various target audiences. Marketing can come and say, we're building a new, we're creating a bit of demand for a new product in the fintech space in Germany, for example. And you can then take that and set some key results around sales, saying, look, you've still got your targets. Don't worry too much about the big objectives, but we want to build some key results specifically around how you're qualifying leads and how you're qualifying people through your pipeline. We have another question from, sorry, carry on, please.
I was going to say, when it comes down to it, this is all just a tool, one of the tools in the management bow, in the leadership bow, to be able to get results. And if you're using KPIs to drive an operational team, that's a great method. It works well. Don't change that. Just have OKRs when you need to add something to that, right? You can have it on top of or next to it. In a product team, you're mostly dealing with OKRs. In an engineering team, you're delivering OKRs, but you have Scrum and Agile or some other process that you're using. So you don't need to replace all of these things and have everyone do everything with OKRs. You can have them in parallel, because different groups work in different ways, and you've just got a whole lot of different methods, like levers to pull as a leader to get the right results. And OKRs are really about saying, here are the things that are really, really important that may not be urgent and are not getting dealt with very well in other mechanisms that we really want to do. So here's how we're going to make them happen. But sales already has an incentive scheme, so that kind of works.
Yeah, I think that speaks a little bit to Hanan's question there around getting OKRs into engineering teams. I think the product people probably get this more than anyone else, but the engineering teams have their various different ways of doing things, and I think possibly that could lead to a bit of resistance. So getting product and engineering aligned around OKRs, what is your experience around that?
Yeah, so I think this is a really good example, actually. This is where having company OKRs, everyone can subscribe to them because that's the company goal, company objective, right? When you then go down to the product level, I like to suggest that product teams and product managers set the product OKRs, and engineering's primary role is, in a sense, kind of like operations, in that you're delivering something to deliver those OKRs. Now, as an engineering team leader, I might well have an OKR or a set of OKRs that are designed to improve my engineering capability, right? But there's no point in me duplicating product OKRs. I'm working on those ones, so we're sharing them. And it's not necessarily, I'm not saying that product sets them separately. You collaborate together, because there's no point in product setting an OKR that engineering hasn't subscribed to. But there's no point in having the same sort of set of objectives and key results here, or in a variation here, or trying to duplicate that work. Just share them. That's what you're trying to do. You're trying to work together. But as an engineering team, you may well have something about code coverage, or release trains, or continuous deployment, or whatever it is that you have. Maybe recruiting, maybe morale, or whatever it is that you have that's important for the engineering team. But you have to recognize as an engineering leader that scope is a small part of your work, whereas the big part of your work is delivering the product, which you're collaborating with the product on. So that's I hope that's a relevant thing for Hanan. I hope that makes sense.
Yeah, no, that's brilliant. And I think well, sorry, my next question there would be around, do you find that after introducing OKRs to a team, that the team fundamentally changed? Like, you would have had these silos previously in an organization where product and engineering work quite differently. So they wait for briefs, so they engineering build according to what product is saying. But by introducing OKRs, do you find that you can get a little bit more cross collaboration? Do teams reorganize themselves where product and engineering are mixed in cross-functional teams? Do you find that the OKRs actually bring change into how that organization is structured?
Yeah, so I mean, I do. But one thing I like to say is that OKRs don't do anything, right? So you can set all the OKRs you like, but nothing happens until you're actually leading and actually doing things as a leader and as participants in this. So usually, if I'm working with an executive team, one of the changes that I like to see, which has to be driven by leadership, which includes the CEO, obviously, but also like the CPO, the chief product, CTO, the chief of marketing, the chief of sales, all those people, they need to consciously drive this, especially led by the CEO, but they have to consciously drive this, is that how do we collaborate based on this understanding of what we're trying to achieve here? And what we're doing is we're changing the nature of the conversation. So previously, people tended to be quite siloed and understand, and well, that's just marketing topic. I don't know marketing because I'm an engineering leader, right? So you do the marketing thing, and the marketing person likewise says, well, that's an engineering thing. You're all nerds. But I mean, what you're trying to do is get that conversation about what's the plan, what are you doing, how do I, as an engineering leader, understand your marketing plan to make sure that we collectively, as a group of people, are collaborating to deliver the results that we've agreed to do. So it's all about the leadership and the way that conversation can change in that meeting. That's why I do leadership coaching. I use OKRs as a tool to get leadership coaching in, because I talk to them about how to run those meetings and how to make sure that collaboration is actually happening. And the OKRs are really North Stars to focus that conversation on, as opposed to magical tools that change things, right? So it's basically, that's what we're trying to achieve. So what's the best way of achieving this, given that we have this brains trust of people in the room? Let's all talk about marketing. Let's all talk about engineering, right? Let's all try and solve these problems. And then that creates that collaboration across, as this team starts to own it as a whole, as opposed to feeling like silos. So, yeah.
Yeah, and you probably find that the more you do that, the more you'd be open to sharing your OKRs externally with other stakeholders, because you want people to understand what you're doing and how you're doing it collectively. I missed a question from Jan earlier. Hi, Jan. I haven't seen Jan in years. I know him from the Cape Town days, but I think he's also moved into Europe. I wouldn't even know. Berlin, I think, was the last place I saw you, Jan. But in relation to, and I'm going to read his question, iterating from top-down org OKRs, to what extent and when should these iterations be based on bottom-up metrics from teams as opposed to org-level indicators? Does that make sense?
Yeah. So basically, I think that from my perspective, I'm a big fan of leaders being relatively assertive in leadership. That does not mean dictating things, but it does mean you have a direction in mind, you have a vision, you've collaborated with people, your whole organization, potentially just the leaders, to develop a vision and a strategy or whatever it is. What we're really doing is trying to make sure that we're all aligned on this. And now, if we just go bottom up, what tends to happen is that we have a whole lot of different incompatible directions. And there's really no solution for this except for either mass sort of decision making on a sort of consensus basis, which doesn't tend to work real well. And everyone, as Jan says in the comment here, having everyone talk about everything ends up in analysis paralysis. Exactly. So you need leadership to sort of break the tie here, set some directions. So the way I tend to recommend people do this is for the leaders or the small group of leaders or even the CEO to set the objectives and sort of like have a bit of consultation, but be assertive and set them, and then ask the next layer down to make sure that they're sort of like consulting with their teams as they set the key results. But you don't want to be, you need to do this collaboratively with that team. But the first time around, it's fine to not go too deep here, because if you go too deep, you just end up with this massive, like it takes us 6 months to just have a conversation, even in a smaller organization. So you need to have leaders who have some understanding, and you need to be prepared to take a risk in getting it wrong. And then you need to consult with people and do the actual leadership to say, we talked a bit about this, and this is the direction we've set, we've agreed on, and I know that you're not 100% bought in, but can I have your disagree and commit? Like, can we just go ahead with this, because we need to make some progress here? And some of that is quite uncomfortable, especially in my experience with my Germanic clients, because they tend to be very consensus driven. So it depends on the organization a little bit, but I tend to think leadership is quite essential here. And then as you go, by the way, as you go on down the process, you have that conversation regularly, and because you're having it regularly, you're more engaged with people on what they want to change. So there's a bit of dissatisfaction, creates a conversation. That means the next quarter, now you can have a more informed discussion because you've already had a bit of that discussion through the quarter.
Yeah, I love you snuck in that Amazonian leadership principle, disagree and commit, and I really love that. And it's something that if you can invite people to do that, and invite people to say, look, I'm going to let you know that I disagree, but I'm not going to hold a grudge against you. I'm actually going to commit to it, is so powerful to get initiatives like this off the ground. And the other thing I'd sort of read, in terms of OKR based practices, you setting stretches. This works in growth companies. I think, sort of more established companies that aren't moving, maybe they're on a defender type, they're in defensive mode, or they're protecting their turf. It's the growth companies, you kind of set stretch goals, best practices, you're probably going to get 70, maybe 80% of your OKRs complete. But if you're setting them at 100, if you're getting to 100% completion rate every quarter, you're not stretching enough. Do you have any sort of thoughts around that?
Yeah, so I think this really depends on the individual company's culture and their morale as well. I have been with quite a few companies who are burnt out, and so if your company's burnt out or people are demoralized, it's actually quite important to give them a little bit of space before you start stretching people. But the other thing that's really critical here is actually how do you use OKRs in relation to performance management. And so if people are ever in the situation where they think, if I commit to any form of OKR and then we miss it, and then that comes down in my performance review because we missed the OKR, then what I will do is argue as hard as I can to pull that OKR back to something, with sandbag it to something achievable. The same thing happens in sales. Anyone who's in sales leadership, we're very, very familiar with sandbagging. But sales leadership and salespeople are used to how to deal with it, where the rest of us are less used to it. So what happens is, in this situation, is that people sandbag. So as leaders, what we have to do is make sure that we're setting OKRs and using OKRs as a means of communicating what's valuable and setting the direction and inspiring things and empowering people to solve the problems that matter. And being ambitious enough about it is good. But when we're doing our assessment of people, or assessment of performance, we need to sort of separate a bit from that and say, okay, that's the measuring stick, but never mind where you predicted we'd end up. Never mind what we predicted, because we're not measuring your prediction. We're now looking at, given the context, given your capabilities, given the circumstances, and all the problems that we encountered, and the fact that I, as a leader, have been involved in this process, how can I assess your work? And then I'm assessing the work given the real context. And sometimes it might be much better to have someone who set a massively ambitious objective and key result, or a team or a company that sets a massively ambitious one, misses it, but that's because there was a pandemic or because they underestimated it, but they still done very well. And it might be much better to do that than to go way past a very unambitious goal, right? So you need to separate these things out.
That's a good point and a good call out to separate sort of performance management from the actual OKR and what the team are trying to achieve. And then I think, to Sharon's point, I think she's put a few comments in there. Thanks, Sharon. Less is more. And I say this all the time,
Yeah.
you know, they say 3 to 5, start with 3, you know, so you've got your objective and you've got 3 key results. Keep it simple, get 2 or 3 teams aligned around one objective, see how they work on that, and then you can expand it and bring it down to individual level. Well, time's flown, 29 minutes past the hour, and you know, we could go on and probably ask a few more questions. I'm sure there's going to be a few more in. Once again, thanks for everybody joining the call. If you've got questions for Richard or myself, reach out, connect with us. If you're not connected, connect, follow, whatever you want to do. We're here to help companies scale well. And Richard, I really appreciate the time. We're probably going to have to do a part 2 on working backwards and a few other things from our big tech experience. But I really appreciate the time, and thanks for joining this afternoon. Thanks to everybody else on the call today.
Thanks for the opportunity, and thanks for joining us and listening. Thanks very much. Bye-bye.
All right. Cheers.